Welcome to the Vanderbilt Faculty Interviews. I am here with Isabella Reinhardt, who's a senior lecturer in Classics and Mediterranean Studies, clams as it otherwise is known as. Clams. That's great, and you've got a background in philosophy and a lot of interest in philosophy?
Well, I have a lot of interest. I don't have that much of a background, to be honest. I'm a classicist, but I've dabbled in philosophy in my research and in teaching.
So that's funny. The classicists that I know called me a dabbler in classics. So we have a we have a little bit of an overlap there.
Very complimentary.
That's great. So you started your sort of arc into this. You did a BA in English and Classics at the University of Virginia.
That's right.
And then you did a Postbaccalaureate program at the University of Pennsylvania.
Yes.
And then a PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, and then here to Vanderbilt.
Yeah.
So maybe a question just about what exactly is what did the Postbaccalaureate degree look like? Very curious about what that program is.
Yes. Well, it was great for me. So I did, as you said, my bachelor's was in Classics and English at UVA. So I couldn't quite decide one or the other which to follow. And then I left for a couple of years and did other jobs. And by the time I realized I wanted to go back to classics, my languages were pretty rusty. So I went to Penn for 2 years and really just worked very intensely on making my languages better. So I did a lot of Latin, a lot of Greek, and I was able to kind of brush up on other languages as well that you need for reading the scholarship. And that put me in a good position to apply.
That is fantastic. And so in some ways they built an on-ramp.
Yes, well, that was very lucky. I consider myself very, very fortunate to get to stay at Penn. It's also where I met my husband, and he did a PhD with me. So together,
how fortuitous!
Yes, it was really blessed. Yeah,
that is fantastic. And so we have the arc. We have the arc from Penn here to Vanderbilt. Mm-hmm. You do a lot of work in this really sort of rich overlap area between these Greek poetic traditions and these Greek philosophical traditions. So I'm going to ask on the philosophy side because that's where I'm living. What got you into philosophy? What was the sort of the spark that brought you in over here?
Well, I found philosophy very intimidating. I didn't even touch it as an undergraduate because it seemed much too difficult for me. And then in graduate school, I got the chance to do a class on Plato and Aristotle, which was presented as a history of ideas class. And I thought, well, that's a little bit more approachable. And then a year or two after that, I ran into Parmenides and Heraclitus the first time. And it was like the worst crush you've ever had. All of a sudden, I couldn't think about anything else, and it made me very happy, and I just wanted to focus on this all the time. But on the other hand, I was already deeply committed to Aeschylus. So I had to find a way to bring the two together and make us one happy family.
And what an amazing bit of crossover work we've got here. And so let's start with the Parmenides case. So part of your research is in terms of finding, so we'll say in a broad context, you're finding PreSocratic philosophical themes in these sort of particularly Attic or Athenian poetic traditions. Is that right?
Partly. So part of it is, one of the projects I'm working on now, in fact, is finding pre-Socratic influence in Aeschylus. But part of the work, too, is just putting them all together and saying, if we don't look at them as themes in one and themes in the other, for example, if we see them as a group of thinkers, what thoughts can we draw out of all of them? And what kind of intellectual currents do we see at work in all of these people at the same time? So
let's dive in to Parmenidean themes in Aeschylus.
Yes.
So, what Parmenidean themes are we seeing? And then we'll jump to and particularly the Agamemnon. That is where the work is being done. So, what Parmenidean themes are we seeing? What are the themes to pull out?
So in the Agamemnon specifically, there's this hymn to Zeus, where the chorus is talking about a human sacrifice that's happened at the very beginning of the Trojan War. And they're recounting this terrible story, and then they stop, and they sing to Zeus as somebody who can't quite be reached. And they say, Zeus, whoever he is, if it's pleasing to call him, I'm going to address him this way. And they go on in this long hymn. And there are certain aspects of this hymn that seem to me to be very close parallels to Parmenides. So for example, they talk about Zeus as somebody who sets humans on the road to understanding. So we get this image of human beings being set down on a road, and they have to walk on it and get somewhere where finally there's knowledge. This reminds me very much of Parmenides' Three Roads of Inquiry, right? So in Parmenides, we have the goddess who's narrating his poem, and she tells the youth, well, there are three roads for thought. And there's the thought that says is, and that's the right thought. That's the one that's going to get you to truth. And there's the road that says is not. And you can't even start on this road, she tells you, right? Yeah, I absolutely forbid it. And then apparently there's this third road which confuses the two. And that's one that you and I are on, right? Mortal beings, we wander on this path that confuses is and is not, and we're always contradictory and trying to figure things out. So when I saw this road to understanding in Aeschylus, that made me think of Parmenides, and I looked around for parallels, and it turns out there are no other roads of thought attested before these thinkers. There are roads of song and roads of speech, but that's not really the same thing as progressing down a road while you're thinking. And that was my smoking gun that kind of set things off.
And so let's hear a little bit more about, particularly, so once we have the road as, you might say, the initial bit of evidence to see these parallels, on the other side of once we get to truth, or once we get, you might say, the sort of the inklings of what that is, what are some other things that you're seeing in parallel between those programs?
So I think the point of this parallel is to tell us something in Aeschylus about the chorus and about what it means to try to figure out what Zeus is. So Parmenides is telling us what being is and how you can talk, and how you can say something truthful about being, and how you can come up with a true thought about something that really exists. What the chorus is trying to do in the Agamemnon is to gain some kind of ethical knowledge about the world they're in. They want to understand Zeus because Zeus is the person who causes everything in the world, right? And so when you find out who Zeus is, then presumably you also understand why things happen. So they're trying very hard to get to this object of thought, which is like what Parmenides describes, and they can't quite do it. So Parmenides, he sets up an object of thought and a legitimate being that we could get to through logical progression. And Aeschylus takes that idea. He says, oh, look, here's something abstract, something you could get to that if you knew it, it would be very important. But his chorus kind of misses out on the logical progression part, and they can never quite get there. So we've got Aeschylus taking Parmenides' idea, taking this idea of an abstraction that's very important, but rendering it in such a way that we can never access it. So it's a lot more negative than what Parmenides gives us.
So then a question, because Parmenides does give us a whole second half of the poem, which is about how to live in the world of becoming and so on, which is how to not be drawn off the road and to how to sort of, in some ways, manage the illusion, which seems to be a really, itself, an interesting program. Is there an answer? Is it like, would a Parmenidean have to say something back to Aeschylus? But there's a second half of the poem, which is how to handle things if you can't live in being, or if you can't live in the truth.
Yes, well, so that's a very good question. So it doesn't seem to me as if there's anything in Aeschylus about this second half of the poem, the dachshund, right? And that would be strange, because you think, if I'm writing a drama, I'm writing about things that happen in the world, so presumably I should be interested in this part of the poem that talks about things in the world. Yeah. I think my suspicion is that Aeschylus is focusing on this first part, this abstract aletheia part, in part because he wants to talk about an abstract Zeus, but also because I suspect this was the more influential part of Parmenides' work. When we get people like Zeno and Melissus, who come and they propagate Parmenides' thought, they're not talking about the part about the real world. They're talking about abstraction. Right. And they're talking about the strange stuff. And when Aeschylus tells us, when Aristotle gives us information about people who are really into Parmenides, he talks about them speaking in funny ways and going through all these mental contortions because they don't want to talk about something in a way that's illegitimate. That's the abstract part of Parmenides, not the corporeal part.
Got it. Okay. And so that ends up being the part that's, in some ways, the sort of the really paradoxical in the Greek sense, in which you're breaking with common sense. That's the part of Parmenides that's in some ways the most striking, and so as a consequence the most influential.
Yes, and that's why I think Aeschylus uses it.
Got it. Mm-hmm. So we have another paradoxical tradition.
Yes.
In Heraclitus. So and you've been working on some of Heraclitus's paradoxes, and you've got a unique take on them. And so tell us first, what's a Heraclitean paradox?
Okay. Well, a Heraclitean paradox. So as you know, the PreSocratics, as we have them, are all fragmentary. And sometimes we have nice big chunks like Parmenides. We've got almost his whole logical argument. It brings us step by step through. Not the case with Heraclitus. With Heraclitus, we have these little sayings, and we don't know how they were connected or how they were organized, and they come through a really difficult tradition. And most of these sayings seem designed to be counterintuitive. So Heraclitus says things like, people think Hesiod was really smart, but he didn't even realize that night and day are the same thing. Or the road up and down are the same. or the most famous, which as Plato gives it to us, is you can't step into the same river twice. So these are the paradoxes, which I find extremely interesting. And my work has been trying to figure out a way to get a consistent doctrine out of these paradoxes, while putting Heraclitus in conversation with his contemporaries like Parmenides and Aeschylus.
So, and Aeschylus. Okay, so that those are the paradoxes. Those are the sort of the surprising statements that seem to break with common sense. A long-standing tradition with these paradoxes has been to interpret them along what's sometimes called the unity of opposites program, which is that that whenever Heraclitus says he doesn't recognize that day is night, it's that those two things actually form a unity, can be true of the same thing in the same way.
Yes.
You've got a different program that's parallel, but it's in fact a stronger program.
Yeah.
Instead of the unity of opposites, which is the traditional interpretation, yours is the identity of opposites. So tell us a little bit more about what that stronger program looks like.
Okay. So the unity of opposites, as you said, it's when we say night and day are the same, they're the same because they can both be true of an underlying object, right? So this is an interpretation of the unity of opposites that deals with a substrate. So they're part of a broader whole, and so they're the same by being participants. So to explain my idea, which is that these opposites are the same in being conceptual identities, not physical identities, but that when we look at the physical world, it should signify to us that the concepts we're applying to it are actually the same. So to get there, I'll start with this river example. So we have a couple different versions of it, but Plato's famous version works as well as any. He says, you can't step into the same river twice. So when we think about that statement, which is really strange, we have to break it down and try to figure out why we can't get into the river twice. At first glance, it looks like, well, we walk into the river, and a river is made of moving water, right? So even though we're standing in the same river, it would look the same on the map, it looks the same if you walk up to it. It's a different river because the water that's running through it is different. And so when I get out and then get back in, it's actually a different river, right?
So that's an identity nihilism program.
Yes.
Right, so we don't, because of the flow, the things don't stay the same.
Yes, and so some people approach this paradox about the river by saying, okay, well, there's the form of the river and the content of the river, and the form is always the same, but the content's always different. I don't find this satisfying, because if you think about the form of the river, what is that? Is that the river bank? Because you can't have a river bank without water in it, because then that's not a river, right? The river itself has to be this flowing water. The flowing water is the form, and so the change is the form, the change is the similarity. So we get this difficult proposition about a river where we see that the very thing that makes it different is the thing that makes it the same, right? A river is a constant changing difference. This seems to me to already be an identity of opposites in the physical world. But I think that we can't really say that opposites in the physical world are identical, because this means that nothing that we see or experience is true. When we look at day and night, we say, look, it's dark right now, and later it won't be dark. Those are different things to us. And I don't want to reject the information of the senses, because actually Heraclitus tells us not to. He says your eyes and ears are pretty good witnesses. So we have to think, okay, if day and night are the same in some way, and the river is both different and the same with itself, these seem to be working in different ways, right? The similarity of day and night is not the same as the simultaneous similarity of the river. I'd like to find a way to make those identity of opposites the same. And it seems to me we can do that by moving it into concepts. To say, when we look at day and night, when we look at the river that's simultaneously the same and different as itself, that should be a sign to us. That's a sign to us that the way we're interpreting the world in making opposites is wrong. That if we look at day and night and we say these are two different things, we're incorrect. Heraclitus is telling us that the conceptual framework we put upon the world in which we make opposites is incorrect, and we should see these things as being oppositional unities. That day and night are part of the same idea that's constantly in tension with itself. And likewise, the river, which is always the same and different as itself, is a sign that sameness and difference are the same thing that's always in conceptual tension with itself. And this we can abstract in a kind of fractal model of the world, as the ancients like to do, and say that when Heraclitus is talking about the cosmos, he's talking about a cosmos that's existing in a state of both rest and change all at once, this dynamic tension, which he himself likes to illustrate by using fire. Fire is something that, in order to stay the same, is always consuming energy, it's always burning and changing, and yet it's remaining fire. And so I think that's a useful emblem to think about the way that opposites can be an identity.
And so one of the other features of this is that we also have an explanatory program then that comes out of this. So when Heraclitus says, for example, war is the father of all.
Yes, justice is strife.
Justice is strife. Excellent.
Yeah.
It looks like these productive tensions, part of it is that, in fact, we need in some ways to acknowledge the opposites, but their opposites in some ways are, their opposites are not, you might say, fully distinct features, but in fact require each other. That's just a point about contrastivism. Yes. But also in their opposition seem to create something and create a unity that itself comes back and makes an identity of the two, or is because the issue is to be able to explain and to be able to come to terms with the fact that we have what looks on its face like a set of contradictions about the world. This is the Parmenidean challenge.
Yes.
But also to be able to explain why these events happen as opposed to those events, some other kind of event.
Yes. So I think in terms of explaining the contradictions in the world, Parmenides would want to explain that. And he'd say, look, this makes the world invalid, right?
Yeah.
You can't have opposites because that implies the not being of one of them. So that's not okay for Parmenides. Yeah. But for Heraclitus, he'd look at them, I argue, and he'd say, if you think these things are opposites, you're thinking about the world wrong. They're part of the same thing, and the conflict that's within them is generative. When he says war is the father of all, the idea that there's this internal tension to everything we see is what makes life happen, right? Because without it, we wouldn't have a river. If the water was always still, we'd only have puddles.
Right. That's right. Yeah. A lake that's, or I'm sorry, a river that's not moving is just a long lake.
Yeah.
So a question, and maybe a sort of an unscripted one. One of Heraclitus's other analogies is in terms of how the logos is at work in the world is that it's stirring the kaikeion.
Yes.
This posset
barley drink.
Yeah, the bar, like it's what is it? Wine, barley, and so yes,
a pennyroyal,
and and maybe some onions in it.
Yeah.
Like was there cheese? So a question of all classicists who've worked on Heraclitus: has anyone have you ever had anyone try to make you a kaikeion?
I haven't, thank goodness. I don't think I would consider him a friend. Yeah.
I thought that it was supposed to have some sort of healing property, but yeah, it's like never been that hurt. Okay.
No.
So, okay, we'll keep the wine. Wine and cheese are good, but we just don't put the cheese in the wine. Okay, so this was really enlightening, and thanks for clarifying this really interesting view. And so I want to ask you about your teaching.
Yes.
So, so the classes that you're teaching for the classics department here, we've got a Greek history class. Tell us a little bit about the Greek history class.
Yes, so Greek Civ. For me, this was a very intimidating class to teach because I'm not a historian, but I approach it as a literature person, which is what I've always been. You know, some things you cannot change about yourself. And so when I teach it, it's broadly a literary survey. From Homer through the end of the Peloponnesian War, actually through the Hellenistic age. We read some Hellenistic poetry. Okay. And so it's history through the lens of poetry and literary production. And it's a lot of fun that way. We get to read a lot of the really fun works. We read Aeschylus's Persians, we get to read Oedipus, but then we also get into the really good parts about Thucydides that make people doubt, human goodness.
Oh, the Melian dialogue.
And Plato,
and then, of course, Plato. Right, yes. Excellent.
Yeah.
And so a question then. So, is part of this also tracing not just history, but narrative traditions too, that we've got, because in some ways we've got the sort of an old Greek kind of tension between historia and mythos, and so a question is this a theme that emerges from this class, or is this would Thucydides himself, or would Herodotus, though he's maybe the most reliable person keeping those two separate, would someone in that Greek historical tradition have sort of scratched their head about this, or is there a story to be told about how they work in parallel?
Well, we do pay a lot of attention to the way that earlier literature is incorporated as Greek history develops. So we look a lot at the kind of Homeric influences in Herodotus, who's a good example to bring up.
Great person.
And we look at how Plato himself, or how Socrates in the Apology is presenting himself as a kind of hero to the city. So you can trace Homer through everything. I wish we had more time to read the Poetics, for example, because then we could really talk about what makes these different genres and how we should think about them, since Aristotle's writing after all of these people. But so to answer your question, there is some of that.
Yeah, and Aristotle having the sort of the benefit of being able to look back on all of this and to be able to categorize it. He does a little bit of does a lot of back patting a lot of those lines. I myself in my classes call it Aristotelian triumphalism. If they only had my view of things, right? So yeah, hindsight's 20/20. So we've got another class on Greek myths, which is in this regard. So we've got an Historia class, and then we have a class on the Mythos. So tell me about the Greek myths class.
So the Greek myths class, which will be different, for everybody teaching it in our department. When I teach it, it's a survey of literature. So we get these myths through the literature that we're reading, and I focus on the different ways we can interpret these myths in order to extract meaning from them. Right. So we start with the premise that people tell myths for a reason, right? It's not just because they're bored or because they have nothing to do. They're telling myths to carry meaning from one person to another. And so if we get to that meaning, we'll get to the reason why people tell myths. And so I use a number of different kind of historical theoretical tools for interpreting these myths that we work through. So we talk about functionalism and structuralism, myth and ritual, and Freudianism. And then we do a certain amount of questioning these tools. So by the end of the class, we get to Ovid and the Metamorphoses. Half the fun is in looking at the Metamorphoses and drawing morals out.
Yeah. Which of these tools are we going to use?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And so you look at the Metamorphoses and you say, is there a moral lesson here? Yeah. But then the moral lesson seems to be things like, don't have bad luck. And you look at that and you say, well, how could I possibly act on that lesson? So looking at the development of these stories and the way people use the same stories to very different ends is, for me, where a lot of the fun is of the Greek myths class.
Fantastic. Don't have bad luck. That's excellent.
Yes.
That's excellent but untakeable advice.
Don't make the gods upset.
Well, right, yeah.
Yes.
That, by the way, is good advice. Just which gods you got to avoid. They seem to disagree about things.
Exactly.
So tell me about and so speaking of the gods disagreeing about things, you have a class on the Trojan War.
Yes.
That right there is a puzzle and a half.
Yes.
So tell me about that class.
The first thing we do is we sacrifice a chicken at the beginning of every class, just so that nobody gets angry at us.
That's exactly it.
We make sure that we've got everybody feeling particularly propitious before we start talking about this. But no, the Trojan War class has been looking at the idea of Troy and the Trojan War as a kind of emblem in Greek and Roman literature. And as a kind of archetype for any war itself, but also for destruction. So we started out by reading the Iliad. We did the whole thing. It was great. Then I divided the class up into different kind of topics. So we spent about 2 weeks just looking at what happens to women after the war. And for this, we read a lot of horrifically depressing plays by Euripides. And then we spent a little bit of time looking at the nostoi of the heroes. So we read the Agamemnon. We read little excerpts of the Odyssey. What happens when you get home? Yeah. We also spent some time looking at the combatants. So we read the Ajax, because Ajax, he commits suicide at the end of the play. Yeah. And we looked at the Philoctetes. So the men that are kind of involved in the outsides, the kind of edges of this war, right, and how they process it. Now at the end, we're reading the Aeneid, which starts off with the fall of Troy and ends with a kind of alternate Trojan War. So we've got it as both a beginning and an ending here to see how the idea of Troy and how the idea of war changes.
And part of so invoking Herodotus here and invoking in some ways even Virgil's explanatory program, because Herodotus invokes the Trojan War to help explain some of the problems between East and West.
Yes.
And Virgil, in telling the story of Aeneas's trip home, seems to plant the seeds of an explanatory program of the problem between Carthage and Rome.
Yes, he definitely does. And the relationship between Dido and Aeneas.
Yes.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting. I didn't intend starting this class for it to be kind of a question of how people think about war. I just intended to look at a certain set of myths around a particular topic. But it's really kind of developed into a meditation on what war meant to the given author. I think for Virgil, this explanatory program is part of that. It's part of the questioning of the Trojan War that we see both at the beginning and the end of the Aeneid. What does it mean to end with a recapitulation of the terrible destruction we saw at the beginning? And Dido, she's so sympathetic. And if this is the beginning of the Punic Wars, well, that really colors our understanding of everything that follows. Even though those were the good wars for the Romans.
Yeah, those were supposed to be the good wars
Yeah.
for the Romans, but it does seem to paint the Carthaginians in a different kind of light, or at the very least, the proto-Carthaginians
Yes,
in a
yeah,
in a
if
different
not
light.
Hannibal.
Yeah, right. Yeah, Hannibal is the problem. That
Yeah.
is the needle to thread there. So the last one, and getting back to the sort of the philosophical edge to this,
Yes.
you got a Plato course.
Yes.
In the works. So tell us about the course, and then tell us about a timeline for whenever we might be seeing that on the books.
So I think that's going to be next spring, if everything works out well.
Right.
That is my hope. For Plato, it's going to be roughly a survey course. We're going to work through different texts, but I want to use it both as a way for me to learn more about Plato, because there's always more to learn. But the main questions that are animating this class are, how can you know things? What can you know? And then, bearing on that, what does it mean to be good? Because in Plato, these questions about what you know and how you're good are very intimately connected, as they are in Aeschylus, I think. Going back to this question of who Zeus is, that's a factual question, but it's also an ethical one, right? Because if you know who this is, then you know why things happen. So for Plato, we know that if you really know something, it affects your actions. And I'm very interested in the question of reality and what reality is. So I'd like to spend the course looking at, first, what can we know, namely what's reality, and how does that change us and make us good once we know it?
Hopefully, to know the good is to do the good.
I hope so.
We just hope that knowledge is possible. That's
Yes, that's it. You always have to count backwards. Yes.
Go a little bit one more step earlier. Dr. Reinhardt, thank you so much for your time with me today. This was really great and really enlightening. Thanks very much. Keep watching.